In the book of Exodus, we are told that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. The name Ramses is inconceivable in the 15th century. Why is that? Because the first Pharaoh, named Ramses, came to the throne only in 1320 BCE. More than a century after the traditional biblical date of the Exodus. So this is what we have collected so far. The expulsion of the rulers of foreign land is dated around 1570 BCE. The Exodus, per correlation of the reign of Israelite kings outside Egyptian and Assyrian sources, if we add them, is 1440 BCE. And then the first pharaoh named Ramses is 1320 BCE. How do you resolve these dates? Any clues? How do you align these dates to resolve them? Well, there's a solution to it. As usual, there's always a solution to anything. The answer or the solution is that some biblical scholars argue that the 480 years mentioned in the biblical text, which Mr. CJ just talked about, is just symbolic. How is it symbolic? It's not real date. It's just symbolic. It represents the lifespan of 12 generations, each lasting the traditional 40 years. So they play with the number 12, 40 years a generation. 4 times 12 is 48. You add the 0, 480. So, yeah, it's just symbolic. Okay. Some scholars also argue that since we have the mention of Ramses, then what we have is an authentic historical memory. So let's run with that. So it would mean that the Exodus might have occurred in the 13th century. That is where you get the 13th century idea from. Because Ramses is mentioned, and we know when the first Ramses is on the stage. So now we zone in on the 13th century for the Exodus. It means that the Hyksos, the expulsion, is not talking about the biblical Exodus. It means that the dates that we got from the biblical text itself is just symbolic. Let's run with Ramses, because the argument is that it may have preserved a historical memory. I don't have a problem with that. Well, Egyptian sources report that the city of Pi-Ramses, which is the house of Ramses, was built in the delta in the days of the great Egyptian king Ramses II. And this is when he ruled, 1279 to 1213 BCE. The sources tell us that Semites were apparently employed in this construction, the construction of the house of Ramses. Okay, so the 13th century is looking very good. Also, the earliest mention of Israel in an extra biblical text was found on the Merneptah stele. Merneptah is the son of Ramses II. And it was at the very end of the 13th century BCE. We've talked about this stele before. It's an Egyptian inscription erected by Pharaoh Merneptah that contains the first extra biblical reference to Israel. It says Israel, when talking about a people, is laid waste. His seed is no more. So it means that by 1220, some sort of Israel has to be residing in the land of Canaan and established there long enough to be worth mentioning that the Pharaoh has defeated them. So the argument is, if a historical exodus took place, it must have occurred in the late 13th century BCE. That is what it is argued. Well, no mention of the name Israel has been found in any of the inscriptions or documents connected with the Hyksos period. Remember, the stele is talking about Israel already being there. When did they get the name Israel? If the Hyksos were Israel, they would have mentioned it. But no mention of the name Israel has been found in any of the inscriptions or documents connected with the Hyksos period. Nor is it mentioned in later Egyptian inscriptions, or in the extensive 14th century BCE Amarna letters. You would think that the correspondence coming from Canaan at that time, at the time of the Amarna letters, to Egypt and back, would mention Israel. Because we have nearly 400 letters, right? 370. Nearly 400 letters. And it describes details in the social, political, and demographic conditions in Canaan at that time. But no one is referred to as Israel. Nobody is called Israel. What do we know after the expulsion of the Hyksos? Egypt became extremely wary of incursions into their lands by outsiders. So from the beginning of the New Kingdom onwards, the Egyptians tightened their control over the flow of immigrants from Canaan into the Delta. They established a system of forts along the Delta's eastern border, and they manned these forts with garrison troops and administrators. We've proved this from last week's class. This is a papyri dating to the reign of Seti II. This is the message sent. Another message to my lord. We have finished admitting the Shasu tribes of Edom at the fortress of Merneptah, Hotep, blah, 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 which is in Chiku. So they're saying that this Chiku place is Ramses. Sukkot. To the lakes of Peatum of Merneptah Hotep. So we see that they have these forts at these places, like we demonstrated last week. In the biblical text itself, it tells us that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Moshe, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp before Pi Hahiroth between Migdol. I don't think the address is correct. Pardon me on the address. The address is not correct. But they're told to turn back, and the place Migdol is mentioned. Well, Migdol is a common name in the new kingdom of Egypt for forts on the eastern border of the delta and along the international road from Egypt to Canaan in northern Sinai. So the mention of Migdol actually confirms that these places were well fortified by the Egyptians after the expulsion of the Hyksos. So if we're saying the Exodus happened in the 13th century, we have these historical facts or archaeological proven facts to contend with. So the escape of more than a tiny group of a tiny group from Egyptian control at the time of Ramses II is highly unlikely. The same with crossing of the desert and getting into Canaan. Highly unlikely, because in the 13th century, Egypt was at the peak of its authority. It was a dominant power in the world. We saw last week that the Egyptian grip over Canaan was firm. They had strongholds built in various places in the country. And they had Egyptian officials administrating the affairs of the region.
So, Rabbi, am I thinking right? Like, even if there was an exodus during this time, by the time they got across the Sea of Reeds, let's call it that, it would have been some Egyptians over there waiting on them.
Absolutely. So it was so airtight that even a small group of people running from Egyptian control will have a hard time making that escape. That's why in the Amaah letters, we are told that a unit of just 50 soldiers was big enough to pacify unrest in Canaan. Just 50 soldiers was what was needed, because that is what the petty kings were asking from Egypt to bring to settle the unrest. Just 50. And throughout the period of the New Kingdom, No, the new kingdom starts when they were expelled. Large Egyptian armies marched through Canaan to the north, as far as the Euphrates in Syria. So the main overland road that went from the delta along the coast of northern Syria to Gaza and then into the heart of Canaan was of utmost importance to the Pharaoh's regime. When we read, this is important, when we read the annals of the great Egyptian conqueror, Thutmose III, it tells us that he marched with his troops from the eastern delta, look at where it is on the map, to Gaza. That's a distance of 250 kilometers. He did that in 10 days. It's the King's Highway. He did that in 10 days. That's extraordinary. This is a painting, a relief from the days of Ramses II's father, Seti I, 1300 BCE. This is the international road from Canaan along the northern coast of the Sinai Peninsula. They had forts and water reservoirs, and these have been traced from the eastern delta to the southern west border of Canaan. What did we find? A sophisticated system of Egyptian forts, granaries, wells, and the archaeology has proven what the Egyptians show on their records. This place was excavated by Ben Gurion University in the 1970s. And they checked out what was on the Egyptian relief. There was a strong fort made of bricks in the typical Egyptian military architecture. There were storage installations for food, provisions, and water reservoir. So there is no way that you can argue an exodus at this time. So, putting aside the possibility of divinely inspired miracles, because that would be your only go-to answer, one can hardly accept the idea of a flight of a large group of slaves from Egypt through the heavily guarded border, fortifications in the desert, and then into Canaan in the time of such a formidable Egyptian presence. Not possible. Any group escaping Egypt against the will of the Pharaoh would have easily been tracked down, not only by an Egyptian army chasing it from the delta, but also by the Egyptian soldiers in the forts in the northern Sinai and in Canaan. So not only do you have to contend with Egypt in Egypt, not only do you have to contend with those manning the forts, that is the road that you would take to get to Canaan, there were people in Canaan. Egyptians in Canaan that were also manning the place. So the 13th century is a bit difficult. The biblical text hints at the danger of attempting to flee by the coastal route. We're told Now, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people round about by the way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds. Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt.
Rabbi,
This is CJ.
as they say, pump your brakes, pump your brakes. So why is it saying the land of the Philistines? Were the Philistines on the scene at this time, or is this an anachronism or something like that? You laughing at me, bruh? Don't laugh at me, bruh. Laugh, you can.
They were not. So they tell us something. It tells us when the person was writing. We'll come to that.
So, Rabbi.
Yes, sir.
So would it be fair to assume that the crafters of the text, or at least as they describe the route out of Egypt, had some level of familiarity with it, of this?
Yes.
Because when you read the long, weird way they exited, it seemed like, like why? I mean, it's not like it's men, women, children, elderly, cattle. Would not make much sense. Moses wouldn't be much of a leader leading people on that one. That's a perilous trip.
Correct. So yes, you have a point there. I think we'll prove your point. Yes, let me not get ahead of myself. But yes, you have a point there. We'll get to that very shortly. So yes, the biblical narrative itself hints at the danger of attempting to flee by the coastal route. So the only alternative would be to turn into the desolate wastes of the Sinai Peninsula. And that is what we are told they did. But the possibility of a large group of people wandering in the Sinai Peninsula is also contradicted by archaeology. What am I doing? I'm following what the text has said. The places where they settled, they went. We're following it. In the abundant Egyptian sources, the Egyptians documented the New Kingdom. There are a lot of sources from the New Kingdom. So in the abundant Egyptian sources describing the time of the New Kingdom in general, and then the 13th century in particular, there is no reference to Israelites, not even a single clue. We know of nomadic groups from Edom who entered Egypt from the desert. We know of that. The Merneptah Stele refers to Israel as a group of people already living in Canaan. But we have no clue, not even a single word, about early Israelites in Egypt. Neither in monumental inscriptions on walls of temples, we don't have that. We don't have them in tomb inscriptions, we don't have that. We don't have them in papyri, we don't. I mean, Israel is absent as a possible foe of Egypt, as a friend of Egypt, or even as an enslaved nation in Egypt. We have nothing. Also, in Genesis 47, we are told that Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it. and were fertile and increased greatly. So we are being told that a group of people came to settle, a unique group of people came to settle in this territory called Goshen. They were the only ones there, and they acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. What does the archaeological data say? There's simply no finds in Egypt that can be directly associated with the notion of a distinct foreign ethnic group living in a distinct area of the Eastern Delta. We don't have that. What we have is a concentration of migrant workers from many places living in a distinct area of the Eastern Delta. That is what we have. We don't have just a distinct group of people living in Goshen. No, we have a concentration of migrant workers from many places living in a distinct area in this place. So what the text describes is a bit challenging and difficult. It describes the survival of a great number of people under the most challenging conditions. And some archaeological trace of this generation-long wandering in the Sinai should be apparent. It should be. But except for what the Egyptians said they had, the forts that I said was along the northern coast, we can verify the Egyptian records and see what they said they had there, and it was there. But not a single campsite or a sign of occupation from the time of Ramses II and his immediate predecessors and successors has ever been identified in Sinai. How come we find what the Egyptians say they did, but we can't find nothing from us? And this hasn't been from lack of trying. Repeated archaeological surveys in all regions of the peninsula have yielded only negative evidence. Not a single shed, no construction or structure, not a single house, no trace of an ancient encampment. Nothing. Zero. Zilch. We cannot blame the technology because modern archaeological techniques are quite capable, extremely capable. But there is simple no such evidence at the supposed time of the Exodus in the 13th century BCE. Nothing. So you understand my conclusion earlier, from some time back, that the Exodus did not happen at the time and in the manner described in the Bible. When we examine the evidence at specific sites where the children of Israel were said to have camped for extended periods during their wandering in the desert, this conclusion seems irrefutable. If you tell me some people stayed at a place for 38 years, they must have left something. They should have left something. There is no way they would clean up. That's good. Questions, contributions still here? Till I give you more evidence, and then I point out where the narrative, what background we should be looking at it from.